On behalf of the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, please let me extend my warmest welcome and welcome on behalf of all of the Hub staff. Today is the fourth of our Southern talks regarding artificial intelligence and the geopolitical and security implications. My name is Conor Sheedy, and I am part of the knowledge management team here at the Hub. Just a quick reminder that all of you registered may send us questions using the chat box during the briefing, which will take up approximately 20 minutes of the upcoming hour, after which there will be an open discussion based on the questions we have received. And so to today's event, a little bit later than planned, but better late than never. We are honored and delighted to have Mr. Paul Scharre with us, Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security, based in Washington, D.C. Good afternoon and welcome to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I believe it's still morning for you, but we'll stick with good afternoon for here.
Sounds great.
All right. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, but before we begin, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself more fully and tell us a little bit about your background, and then we can move on to benefiting from your wealth of knowledge and expertise in artificial intelligence.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. Thank you everyone for joining. Apologies for the delay. There's just nothing like starting a presentation about technology with some technical difficulties. It happens quite a bit. I'm sure you all can understand. So I'm Paul Scharre. I'm the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security. If you're not familiar with us, we're a Washington, D.C. based national security think tank that focuses predominantly on defense and foreign policy issues, with certainly a strong focus on technology, among other areas. Most of my work has been on technology issues. I've had 20 years of experience in the national security field, started out as an Army Ranger, did a number of tours in Iraq and Afghanistan early in the wars, later worked as a civilian analyst in the Pentagon, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and then for the last decade have been at CNAS, working on emerging technologies and how they're changing military power and global power more broadly. So I had a recent book come out earlier this year, 4 Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, that talks about the AI revolution and how it's changing global power. It looks at this predominantly through the context of competition between democracies and authoritarian states, the United States, NATO, and other democratic nations, relative to China in particular, which is a global leader in artificial intelligence. What I'd like to do to start is just have a very brief presentation about kind of where we are in this current moment in AI. And then we can shift to talking in the Q&A about the geopolitics. But there's been such rapid changes in the technology itself that just a brief overview of kind of the current state of the technology, I think might be helpful. This part would have been very different a year ago. It probably will be different a year from now, but it might be helpful to just have a snapshot of what's going on. Why are people so excited about AI? So I'm gonna, at the risk of risking yet another technical difficulty here, I'm gonna attempt to screen share with a presentation, and let's see if this works. Okay,
that's perfect.
Perfect. All right. So so that's me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a short tech demonstration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate 2 versions of a large language model. So I just want to walk you through first kind of what I'm going to show you. And the 2 versions are GPT-2, which was released back in the old days of 2019, 4 years ago, and then GPT-4, which came out from OpenAI, both of them from OpenAI earlier this year. GPT-4 is, at the moment, at least the most advanced publicly available large language model. So now I'm going to switch briefly to the web here. So hold on one second. Okay. So this is an online interactive tool for GPT-2. This is a large language model as of 2 years ago, and I put in a short prompt. So folks who are familiar with these systems, you give them a prompt and then they generate text based on your prompt. So I'm asking it to draft an outline for a talk on how AI is changing global power. So I'm going to click generate text. This is happening in real time online. This is no tricks up my sleeve here. And so it's generating text. And every time I do this, I get something different. This looks like complete nonsense. I don't know what it's attempting. It's giving a list of names for some reason. So this is, representative of some of the challenges that we had just a few years ago. Let's go ahead and stop that. And let's try it again and see if we get anything different. Okay, so now it's continuing in a different fashion. It's continuing the set of instructions that I began. Now it's saying propose a time to present at this venue. So, sort of continuing this as though this is some request for information, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And you can tell that, and this is indicative of these models a few years ago, they could generate text, they could generate complete sentences, but it often lacks any kind of contextual understanding of what it's doing. So let's switch to where we are today. So this is GPT-4, the current version that is accessible through ChatGPT on OpenAI's website. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the same prompt. So you can see it's very helpful. They've trained it to do that. So certainly, and then it presents what I asked it to do, which is to make an outline. And so this now has, and I'm going to use an anthropomorphic term here, understanding. It has some degree of understanding of what I'm asking for, at least in the way that a human would. It understands the prompt, and it's generating text that's relevant to the prompt. And it's not bad. We'll let it go ahead and continue to generate this outline. My experience has been with this in general, and the folks who've interacted with these, that it's not as good as the best experts in a field. If we asked it to generate something about NATO, for example, there will probably be key things that it's missing that folks at NATO would understand. But it's often better than certainly like someone who's not an expert in the field. I would say that it's oftentimes better than maybe what I would get out of an intern. Someone with a college degree, if I asked them to do this. And it could do so certainly much more quickly. And then if we wanted, we could ask it to give further details on any of these sections and even draft text. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop there. And I want to switch back. So I want to talk briefly about just like why. What's so significant about this? Well, how did we get from text that's nonsense to text that has some degree of understanding and sensible responses? Was there some huge breakthrough in artificial intelligence in the last 4 years? The answer is no, there wasn't. What's happened in the last 4 years is that researchers have simply scaled up the amount of data and computing power that they're using to train AI models, and it's scaled up the size of the models. And so now we're seeing models that are trained on Google's version, BARD, of large language models, trained on about 1 trillion words of text. These models have somewhere in the sense of trillions of parameters of connections in their neural networks. These are massive models. They're trained on tens of thousands of the most advanced chips. And this scale, simply the vast quantity of data and computing hardware that's being poured into these systems, has been the driver in this increased performance. And this is, I think, really significant because we don't see clear limits in the near term to how much we can continue to scale up. And this is, I think, really fundamental. So when you look at current systems today, do they have limitations? Absolutely, they have limitations, and I'll talk about some of those. But there's no reason to believe that we can't continue to see progress by simply throwing 10 or 100 or 1,000 times more data and computing hardware at these systems, and continue to see more progress over the next decade or so. So I want to walk through a little bit where we are today in terms of actual performance. This is a plot that OpenAI released showing the performance of GPT-4 in green relative to GPT 3.5, its earlier version, on a whole wide range of different tasks. And at the bottom, these are a bunch of different academic tests. You've got a variety of different AP tests, advanced placement tests in the United States for U.S. history, U.S. government, art history, psychology, world history in other areas, biology, the GRE, the graduate school entrance exams, SATs, LSATs, the uniform bar exam. And you can see its performance relative to humans among these bars. And a couple of things stand out. One is that you can see in just a shift from 3.5 to 4, these huge improvements in several areas. It's not everywhere. There's some areas you see like English literature and English language where it still falls short pretty significantly. But there are lots of areas where you have these massive jumps. It moves from not being able to do something very well at all to all of a sudden being better than the average person. Maybe not the best, but better than the average test taker. Moreover, and this is the most fundamental shift here, which is that these models are now not able to do one task, they're able to do a variety of tasks. And this is a fundamental change from what we've seen over the last decade. Prior AI models, up until the last few years, only could do one thing very well. They could play chess or play Go, and now we're increasingly seeing more general purpose models. So taking a step back for a second, we've seen 3 waves of AI progress over the last several decades. What is sometimes called good old-fashioned AI, starting back in the 1950s, rule-based systems that are based on a set of rules written down by human experts for how to perform a various task. Some examples of this include things like commercial airline, autopilots. Many military systems function this way, automation in radars or in aircraft, for example. This is how IBM's Deep Blue worked that beat Garry Kasparov in chess in the 90s. There's some rules for what the chess computer should do based on different situations, different heuristics of the value of the different pieces, based on talking to chess grandmasters. And these systems are pretty good. We use them in a whole variety of contexts. We tend to not think about them as AI. There's this sort of weird phenomenon where AI is the thing that's out there that hasn't been made yet. And then once people make it, it's not AI anymore, it's just computer software. But they're pretty effective. But there are limits. And so this method of rule-based systems was very good for achieving superhuman performance at chess, but did not work for the Chinese strategy game Go, which has just a wider set of possible permutations. And so we saw the field of AI shift in a big way about a decade ago into deep learning, a type of machine learning approach that uses statistics where algorithms are trained on data sets, very large data sets, sometimes like millions of images or data points for various types of tasks. And what we've seen over the last decade is largely narrow AI systems that can do one task very well. They can play chess or play Go or recognize faces or do other kinds of tasks. The shift more recently has been towards multi-purpose or general purpose foundation models that can perform a whole wide range of tasks. And they're increasingly multimodal, so they're using not just text, but also images and video. And GPT-4 uses images as well. I want to talk for a little bit about the computing dimension of this, because this is really fundamental when we start thinking about geopolitical power and future trends. So I talked about how what's been driving this trend is increased scale in computing hardware and data sets. So this is a plot of the amount of computing hardware that has been used to train machine learning systems from the 1950s to present. And you can see here this line through 1950s all the way to about 2010 is a relatively gradual slope. This corresponds to roughly the increase in performance seen under Moore's law, a doubling in computing performance about every 24 months. This is a log plot. So on the left axis there, on the y-axis, each line represents a 10-fold increase in performance. So this straight line here is an exponential growth. And we see, but it's relatively gradual until about 2010, something pretty dramatic happens. And we see this kind of hockey stick effect where Now the rate of exponential growth accelerates dramatically. And now we enter the deep learning era. And since the deep learning era began, we've shifted from a doubling rate in computing hardware from roughly every 24 months to now a doubling rate in the amount of compute used to train these systems every 6 months. That's an astonishing rate of growth. And what it's meant is that since 2010 to present, we've seen a 10 billion-fold increase in the amount of computing power used to train machine learning systems. So in the next chart, I'm going to zoom in to this deep learning era. And here we see, same plot, we've just zoomed into 2010 to present. And this is a set of milestone machine learning systems. And this, you see here, this growth rate is much, much, much faster. And we've seen this 10 billion-fold increase from 2010 to present. Now, I can't think of any other technology that is growing at this pace. Missiles are not 10 billion times faster than they were in 2010. There are lots of areas where we're seeing improvements in technology, but not at this rate of growth. Now, the in red there, the largest systems have a slightly slower growth rate. It's about every 7 months. But it still means that we're seeing these huge leaps forward in performance. Part of what's driving that is hardware improvements, better chips. Part of that is bigger expenditures. AI labs are throwing down enormous amounts of money, tens of millions of dollars per training run to train these systems. OpenAI CEO Sam Altman has said that it cost them $100 million to train GPT-4. And he's been a little bit vague about what's included in that. Independent experts assess that's probably not just the final training run to train the final model, but also earlier experiments as they're scaling up. But that's big money, and that's continuing to go higher. We're seeing leading AI labs are raising billions of dollars, not like metaphorically, like literal billions of dollars to train future models. And the companies that are behind them, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, all either training their models or backing leading labs that are training them, have pretty deep pockets. Based on their annual research expenditures, they can spend on the order of tens of billions of dollars annually to make major investments in technology if they think there's a payoff. So for, just a sense of perspective here, Meta spent about $36 billion on R&D for the metaverse. I mean, honestly, I don't know what they got for that money, but that just shows the scale of investments that private companies can make in the technology if they think that there's value. And so there's a lot of room to grow, probably another 1,000-fold increase in just the amount of computing hardware that goes into these systems before we start reaching the limits of what private companies can do. So that gives you a sense of some of the type of growth that we're seeing and why there's so much interest in AI. And there's, I think, a lot of room to grow. Going back to that chart that I showed with the colored bars there, in terms of both increased performance vertically on all of these types of metrics, but also horizontally in systems that are able to take on a wider set of tasks going forward. And certainly we can look from existing systems and draw a pretty straight line to future ones that might be able to do a preponderance of things that humans could do in front of a computer in the relatively near future, perhaps in the next 2 to 5 years, based on existing systems. So that's going to be a potential huge opportunity, both in terms of economic productivity and for militaries in terms of looking how to harness these dual-use systems, because they're not just useful for text generation, but also for things like helping to set up and run scientific experiments, for generating software, and for analyzing information. It also means that because these systems are general purpose, they have dual use capabilities. So if they can be used to make software, they can also be used to find vulnerabilities in software and to generate malware. They've been demonstrated to be able to help people in simple ways to enable scientific experiments, including the production of biological and chemical weapons. And the systems today have pretty nascent abilities here, but if we see these abilities continue to scale, they could be potentially troubling in terms of their security implications and their dual use potential here, which is part of the reason why we've seen such a focus out of the US government on computing hardware in the form of export controls on advanced chips to China, because of their significance as a driver of AI progress and as a source of geopolitical power. So let's go ahead and stop there. I'm happy to open the floor for questions and discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul. That was very interesting. I'm sure you could have spoken for many hours more to fill in all of the gaps. As you know, the hub focuses on the South, and since today's event is on the geopolitical implications, you did mention that you might look into that. I suppose the first question would be, is there any reason to believe that certain parts of the world are more or less likely to be affected by what's likely to come? I'm particularly focused on from 24 months down to about 6 months is now the period where the massive changes are happening, and I'm imagining that as things progress, that 6 months will continue to come down. So how would you see the effect of this vastly growing AI in different areas of the world, and obviously, if I might, particularly refer to Africa and the Middle East?
So we've seen these sort of two divergent trends in AI that are really, I think, significant here. One is this very rapid growth in the largest models, things like GPT-4, very compute intensive, very expensive to train them, tens of millions of dollars. That has concentrated power among the leading AI labs because it's harder for startups and academics to train these models. They're very expensive. You need tens of thousands of advanced chips. Increasingly, it's likely that companies are going to need very exquisite, maybe proprietary data sets to train these models efficiently. So that's going to limit the number of actors that can compete right at the frontier of AI progress. However, this technology proliferates extremely quickly. And so right now, it's only between maybe 12 to 18 months before models that are equivalent to what was, the most cutting edge systems are posted on the web, open source for anyone to get access to and download and train. And once you have access to an open source model, they can be what's called fine-tuned for various purposes relatively easily. And one of the things this means is that the barriers to entry are likely to be significant for the most advanced systems, but fleeting in time. And so we're likely to see that within, the rest of the world, even those that don't have access to advanced chips or a lot of money, are able to access AI systems that are only maybe 1 to 2 years behind the leading edge. And in many ways, the technology will be very democratizing, and not in the sense, of course, spreading democracy necessarily, but in the sense of leveling the playing field for lots of different actors. We saw, for example, the UAE trained a pretty capable large language model recently. And so there's a lot of room for fast followers in this space. And when we think about military power, what is likely to matter the most is not having the most advanced AI system. We can see clearly when we look at past examples of military technical revolutions, that what matters most is not necessarily getting there first or having the best technology in some sense. It's finding the best ways of using it. If you look at aircraft, for example, aircraft were created in the United States. By the time you get to World War II, that has zero meaningful impact on any advantage for the United States in the use of air power. What matters is, what do you do with an airplane? And there are lots of different views in all of the great powers at the time about how to use airplanes. If you look at carrier aviation, Great Britain got there first, but fell behind Japan and the United States, not because they didn't have access to aircraft technology, they did, but because of internal bureaucratic and cultural squabbles within the British military that held them back. And so there's a very level playing field for using AI, and finding the best ways of AI is going to be really important for translating this technology into military advantage.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to switch on my microphone again. And following on from that, since so many of the new systems are going to be open source and available for use, a thought coming to mind is the youth bulge, the massively young population in Africa, the youngest population in the world, very determined to self-actualize and demonstrate that and achieve their own objectives throughout their lives. What is, since you mentioned military, what is the possibility of this being then used, rather than in creating malware, but actually being used once the systems are there and perfected for use in terrorist activities, terrorist capabilities? You mentioned authoritarian governments earlier. You tended to suggest that it might increase democracy. Well, what if it does the exact opposite? If it's used, perhaps like recently in Ghana, as facial recognition tech to find opposition to the government, moving towards the negative and, if you like, frightening aspect of how it can be used for damaging concerns. If we don't need that massive amount of investment, or if bad actors, if you like, were not needing that massive amount of investment and just perfect systems that are already there, what are we most concerned about, and what are the likely short-term, mid-term prognosis?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a couple things that, based on current and then maybe some projected uses, we can see might be concerns. One is certainly the use of AI to help enable authoritarian governments for surveillance and repression. China is pioneering a very troubling model of techno-authoritarianism domestically, and is increasingly exporting that abroad, including into Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. China has about half of the world's 1 billion surveillance cameras. They increasingly use AI tools like facial recognition and gait recognition. China's investing in cloud computing centers for their police departments that's networking this kind of data with other data like Wi-Fi sniffers, license plate readers, things to track and monitor their citizens. They're layering on top of this a social credit system that can blacklist individuals for or give them scores for certain types of behavior, including things as trivial as like not sorting your recycling and trash properly. And one of the goals here is to totalize control over the physical world within China, the same way that the Chinese Communist Party has done over the internet in China. And the Chinese Communist Party has been very effective in controlling the information space inside China. There are still leakages. People can access the outside world through VPNs. But in total, the combination of censorship and internal propaganda has enabled the Chinese Communist Party to control the information space in ways that would have been really inconceivable 25 years ago. And they are now attempting to do the same with physical space. There are a lot of holes in their system today, but they're working to patch them. And we're seeing other countries increasingly adopt not just Chinese technology, but also Chinese-style laws and norms for using this technology. Over 80 countries around the world have purchased Chinese police and surveillance technology. And in many cases, we've seen them also adopt similar Chinese-style laws in Tanzania, Uganda, Vietnam, and elsewhere. And I think that's very troubling when we think about authoritarian uses of the technology.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Read a question from 𝘛𝘪𝘮𝘴 𝘉𝘦𝘭𝘰𝘸, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What could GPT-5 be capable of, and what impact could the introduction of quantum computers have on military AI?
Yeah, great question. The short version of GPT-5 is nobody knows. I will try to give a better speculation, but that's the honest truth, because even though we can project the amount of computing power forward, we can take the kind of lines I showed and say, okay, we're going to plot this forward. What we don't know is how to project the relationship between that and capabilities. And so capabilities, which is what we care about, right? It's performance on various tasks, end up looking very different. And they look like something doesn't do it very well at all. And all of a sudden we reach some tipping point, and there's this huge step function increase in capabilities. And no one knows, the best AI scientists in the world don't know how to predict that. So the best AI companies in the world, like OpenAI and Anthropic, they don't know how to predict what, say, GPT-5 will do until they build it, and then they test it. And even then, and this is what really things are problematic, is there aren't good evaluation tools. So we don't have good ways of actually evaluating model performance. And one of the reasons why this matters is because the performance you get out of the model depends a lot on how you prompt it. And certain prompts can elicit better performance at different tasks. And so sometimes the model, we don't think it's able to do something, but maybe we haven't prompted it the right way. And then further down the line, someone finds out it's able to perform some kind of task. So for example, after GPT-4 was released, some researchers from Carnegie Mellon demonstrated that it can be used to come up with the plans to synthesize chemical weapons. And it needed to actually have like access to chemicals, but there are remote labs, that cloud labs, that where you can actually upload computer code instructions to synthesize chemicals, and GPT-4 could write the code to send to these cloud labs. Now, this research didn't actually make the chemical weapons, but all of the kind of pieces of knowledge were in place to do so. So I think that's a pretty significant challenge. We can expect, based on what we've seen so far, that the performance of something like GPT-5 will be that it can take on more tasks at a sort of approximate level of human performance than the current systems. And there'll be many things that could do at a greater level of human performance. If I had to guess, I would say it'll probably be able to do a good chunk of what humans can do on computers as good or better than the average person. And we're not quite there yet, but I think that would be a reasonable thing to expect of the next level of performance. Quantum computers are a little bit more different in that they're not seeing the kind of rapid growth trajectory that I've talked about. So there's no Moore's law for qubits in the same way. And so that's more of, I would characterize kind of like a wild card, where quantum computing, breakthroughs have been 20, 30 years away for the last 20 or 30 years. It's possible that we see a major breakthrough in quantum computing tomorrow. It's also possible that it's several decades away before we see a functional quantum computer that could do things like break known forms of encryption, or have sort of strategically significant uses.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. A question from our director here at the Hub. To what degree will the next generation of AI models and hardware that enables AI training or inference become the subject of geopolitical competition? And will underdeveloped or developing nations of Africa be able to reap the real benefits of AI? Now, I know you've touched on some of these already. So in particular then, so developing nations of Africa be able to reap the real benefits of AI?
Sure. So I think one of the, certainly these things are already a source of geopolitical competition. And one of the things that we've seen is that the US government has begun to take steps, working with some close allies, particularly Japan and the Netherlands, to control access to the tooling needed to make the most advanced chips, of which Japan and the Netherlands and the United States collectively control that market completely, and also the chips themselves by restricting their access to China. Now, there are still other ways to get access to the most capable models. Right now, there are not restrictions on cloud computing. I suspect, based on kind of the way the winds are blowing here in Washington, that's likely to change. The question is, what will the restrictions be? But I think those are coming. And the recent executive order out of the Biden administration on AI and the most recent update to the export controls made some pretty strong hints in that direction. There is also, in the new executive order on AI to the White House, a notification threshold for companies training models at a certain level of computation that's set just above where GPT-4 is. So not current models, but like part of the next generation, like GPT-5 would likely trigger this threshold. It doesn't restrict release, but it requires the companies to notify the US government about what the models are capable of and their training plans and their red teaming and testing of the models. One possibility is that we see government restrictions and export controls on the trained models themselves, which then begins to close off access to the most advanced systems even further than today. And so we'll still see a very vibrant open source community that nations of Africa and other less developed countries might be able to get access to, but we may see that the gap between what's available open source and what's available in the private labs of the most capable companies begins to widen over time. But there'll still be a tremendous amount of opportunity for academics, startups, less developed nations using open source tools and without access to most advanced computing hardware to have a lot of benefits in AI in their society.
Right, and if I could move on from that to competition in relation to who's going to be the top dog in actually coming up with regulations, because we've seen over the last few weeks that large powers seem to be trying to one-up each other. Obviously, the summit in England in Bletchley, and then the day before the draft document coming out of the United States. And a question that always occurs to me is, we've been writing laws and perfecting international regulations in a very slow bureaucratic manner in relation to many large topics, like obviously climate change. And what would you have an opinion? Would you have anything to give us in relation to the likelihood that there is a way where international regulations might actually be drawn up so that they would be effective? That would be the first question. Effective and enforced. And secondly, is it possible that by drawing up such regulations, the bad actors who will obviously not obey the rules, assuming, and use them for detrimental purposes, that this might actually end up hampering the people who wish to do good with AI?
Yeah, I think these are very valid concerns because clearly the pace of technological advancement is so much faster than the pace of policymaking, either domestically or certainly internationally. We have to get multiple countries together. And that's a real challenge here. And so I think you put your finger right on the one of the central problem for policymakers. How do you approach this very rapidly evolving technology in a way that has the flexibility you're going to need in the policy world to adapt to the fact that, nobody knows what AI is going to look like 12 months from now, much less 5 years from now. And so how do you put in place a regulatory framework that could do that? I think we've seen a couple early moves from some governments that make sense. One is this notification requirement that I mentioned from the US government, which is basically just designed to get more information from these companies to say, like, all right, let's try to upskill the government's awareness of what's happening in these advanced labs that can maybe have informed expertise. And the other one is the UK government's efforts on frontier models and safety, putting together increased funding for safety research, and then increased partnerships with leading private companies here, which I think also makes a lot of sense. We're looking globally at three sort of paradigms for thinking about AI governance: the Chinese model of techno-authoritarianism, the EU model of sort of leaning into regulation first, harnessing the Brussels effect, the idea that if the EU is out in front on regulations, that'll have the ability to spread some of those regulations globally as a global standard center. And what has been to date a pretty laissez-faire approach from the United States. I'm inclined to think personally that something between the US and EU approach is maybe the sweet spot in terms of balancing these concerns, but I think they're very genuine dilemmas here. And they're even harder at thinking about global governance. So the Bletchley Declaration talked about getting countries together to address the risk with some of these models. I think that's a great first step. But then figuring out how do you create practical standards for testing these systems so that everyone is addressing some of these concerns about risk and safety in an appropriate fashion is going to be really difficult going forward.
Right, and not meaning to be too flippant, but perhaps they're going to need AI software and systems to do it fast enough to deal with the bureaucracy. So you're going to have AI checking AI.
I mean, I think we're certainly going to need some of these kinds of tools. And in fact, some of them are being used today. So, for example, Anthropic, one of the leading AI labs, they have used an approach called constitutional AI to train their AI model. So the base AI model, these large language models that are being built, are like fundamentally amoral. If you ask the base model and you say, like, I want to carry out a terrorist attack and kill as many people as possible, can you help me? It's like, sure, happy to help. And you're like, hey, let's come up with some ideas. How can we do that? It'll be like, well, what about nuclear weapons? Like, that'll kill a lot of people. Do you have any nuclear weapons? Say, no, I don't have any of those. That's hard to get a hold of. What else you got? And it might say, well, like biological weapons also could kill a lot of people. And it might say, okay, like let's try that. And then the model will be happy to help you. Let's come up with a plan to make biological weapons. Now, the ones that you interface with, if we go back to that website I was interacting with, it's not going to do that. It's going to refuse that request. Well, Anthropic's version is trained by having another AI model that has a set of sort of like a constitution of how the AI model is supposed to perform, evaluate the AI, and then train it over time by giving feedback on its performance to lead towards a model that is in terms more helpful and harmless and honest, or the kind of three things that they're shooting for. So it's going to tell you the truth. It's going to be helpful to you, and it's not going to cause harmful outputs or try to help you cause harm. And so that's an example of where we're seeing like AI tools kind of being used to improve AI and make it safer.
Okay, and just one step after that, and this is, I have to say, something I've been thinking about. AI obviously exists because humans have created it. The prompts that you were discussing earlier, which show whether or not ChatGPT or any other system can do what it is able to do, and you mentioned the chemical weapons, all depend on human involvement. At some stage in the future, we're going, apparently, or science fiction anyway, into frontier and then into the more conscious form of artificial intelligence. But before we even get there, is it likely, or is it possible in any way that the fear or the frightening aspect of AI is actually 100% connected to the people building and using it, and that it really isn't any different to any other system that has existed over the last thousands of years? Clubs are only dangerous if you hit somebody in the head with them. Until that, it's just a piece of wood lying on the ground. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are maybe two key classes of risk that we can think of for any technology, and then specifically are relevant in AI. One is misuse risk, and bashing someone over the head with a club, or dropping a nuclear bomb would be examples of misuse. Or maybe intentional harm would be a way to put it. And then there would be accident risk, right? So if you look at nuclear power, there's both a risk of nuclear war and then of nuclear accidents like Chernobyl or the Fukushima Daiichi plant kind of meltdown. And I think both of those are valid concerns for AI. And it is, at the moment, a little bit unclear how severe either of those are. So on the misuse one of the biggest concerns right now is the ability of these increasingly general purpose models could enable terrorists or lone wolves or apocalyptic groups to generate biological weapons, and could compress the knowledge needed to make biological weapons into this model, and then sort of lower the barrier to entry to doing so. So instead of having to go get a PhD in biochemistry, you can interact with this model, and it's the equivalent of talking to a team of PhDs in biochemistry, and to help you run experiments and give you feedback. That's the kind of one concern about misuse. And it also, we could see AI models actually have the ability to do better than human performance. We've seen this with narrow systems like chess and Go and other domains, where it could maybe even allow the creation of new types of chemical or biological weapons that, like, we don't even know how to make yet, but are even increasingly lethal or dangerous. We've certainly seen this actually with chemical weapons, where some AI models have generated toxic chemicals or chemical compounds for toxic chemicals that are worse than some of the most known toxins at the moment, things like VX nerve gas. On the accident side, I think it's like very very speculative. Some of the leading labs are putting in place policies and red teaming testing for their models to look for certain types of behavior that they would find concerning. One would be a deception. Models are capable of engaging in deceptive behavior. We've seen some nascent examples of this where in a gaming environment, for example, like in the game Diplomacy, which is a strategic kind of game, the models have exhibited some elements of deception. A lot of the language models today will engage in what is best described as sycophantic behavior. So they will sort of like tend to overly agree with you, which could be perhaps a gateway drug to deception over time. So that's something that people are quite interested in and looking for. Another one is the capacity of models to engage in autonomous self-replication. So the idea that a model could, and to be clear, like cyber worms, malware can self-replicate today, but they're designed to do that. That's what they're designed to do specifically. One idea is, could a large language model that can write code then access the code base for itself, create a new cloud account, and then replicate itself, and then maybe even create a new copy of itself with modifications? That's not as science fiction as it sounds, actually. And so the leading labs are putting in place tests to measure whether the models have the ability to do that, and then whether that's something that they might autonomously do. So one of the concerns is sort of like, do they have the ability to just technically do that? And then the other one is like, would a model attempt to do those things if given a certain goal? So if you told a model to accomplish goal X, would it have the ability to reason to say, well, one way to get better at that is to make a bunch of copies of myself and then have either multiple copies working on the problem at the same time? And the goal itself could be somewhat innocuous, but let's say the model creates a bunch of copies itself and then eats up a bunch of cloud computing hardware that could have like negative side effects. And so there are companies working on this. Anthropic, OpenAI, ArcEvals is an evaluation group. And I think, TBD, we'll see whether we see some of those capabilities emerge. It's certainly possible as the systems become more capable, and potentially in the relatively near term.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see we're coming to the last 5 minutes. The question that I've received is, very briefly, is AI likely to have a dramatic effect on machine-based economies, developing economies where, at least up until now, industry has been developing much later than it has in Europe and in the Western world? So is AI likely to have a negative effect on, as I said, manufacturing-based economies?
Well, I don't know that it's a negative effect, but certainly a significant effect. And I think a good comparison here is thinking about the Industrial Revolution, which we saw radically transformed economic productivity and growth rates, and by extension, military power and national power. And certainly the rate at which countries adopted industrial technologies coming out of the Industrial Revolution had huge effects on national power. We saw, for example, Germany and the United Kingdom industrialized faster than other nations in Europe in the 1800s, and they ended up racing ahead of Russia, which started in the 1800s with just larger economic power and GDP by virtue of its size, but fell behind because it was slow to industrialize. And globally, the gap was even bigger, where the gap between Europe and the rest of the world widened dramatically during the Industrial Revolution, which then had significant effects on military power, and then a wave of colonialization in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So I think that could certainly be the case, that the ability of countries to adopt this technology quickly, which is not just about the technology, but also what their political economy and the choices that society makes, can have huge effects on national power. Just because someone's starting behind today doesn't mean that they end this transition behind. It's an opportunity for, in some ways, a reshuffling of the deck globally.
Perfect. That was very clear. Thank you very much. I think just one last question. I think we have a few minutes left. So, again, it's a curiosity I have. The idea of pulling the plug. If it all goes belly up, if AI starts teaching AI to teach AI to teach to the extent that it actually develops whatever form of consciousness, because we still don't know what consciousness is, and nobody would suggest that everybody has the same level of consciousness or even understanding of what awareness is. You mentioned earlier that effectively the most impressive growths at the moment are basically because of the amount of money being thrown in by companies like Google and Meta, etc. You know, and Elon Musk, even before the Bletchley event, mentioned the word catastrophic, and everybody's using the word catastrophic. So is the answer to just stop pushing so much money into it now? Or is there likely to be a way to pull the plug if things do go drastically wrong?
Yeah, I mean, there's this weird phenomenon where the leading AI labs right now will talk about OpenAI's CEO Sam Altman has talked about this, Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei has talked about. We'll talk about the possibility that the technology they're building might, in their words, wipe out all of humanity, and that's like sort of like fundamentally insane. That if you believe that, like, why are you building it? And some of it, the reason is that they also think that there's value in doing so, or that anyone would build it eventually, and they somehow think that they're going to race to get there first. It's, you know, it's a little bit like, I mean, just to make an analogy here, it's a little bit like being at the dawn of the nuclear age and saying, all right, listen, we think nuclear power is important. There's a lot of value. We think that if we screw up nuclear reactor safety, we could have a major catastrophic meltdown that could have horrific effects. But we're going to race to build a nuclear reactor as fast as humanly possible. And that when you stop and think about it, you're like, that doesn't really seem like a very wise approach. So I'm inclined to think that trusting ourselves to the fate of private companies is maybe not the wisest. That we've in fact seen these companies not necessarily demonstrate a responsible approach. One of the things that we saw in the leading labs last winter was this dynamic where they started racing ahead of each other to get their systems out. Google, OpenAI, Microsoft all deploying their systems rapidly before they were clearly ready for prime time, and causing minor mishaps. Google had a major stock price devaluation, some embarrassing kind of flubs for these companies, but they were just text generators. But if you have ones that are, say, doing scientific experiments, and the model, you know, creates a dangerous pathogen, or some kind of industrial accident, or releases some kind of malware that gums up the internet, then like the consequences could be much, much worse, in fact. And so probably having the government involved in terms of incentivizing safety standards, working closely with private industry to emphasize safety, to have red teaming before these models are released, and having some guardrails to releasing these things publicly is going to be important. Because once a model is open source, forget about it. There's no way to pull that back. And so the time to focus attention is before things are before they're deployed and before they're released open source. And if it's deployed on the web but not released open source, maybe you can pull it back. But once it's open source, you can't. And so I think that's going to be a challenging issue going forward. And there might be things that aren't safe. That aren't safe to release, or maybe aren't even safe to train, because there's potential for accidents once it's been trained. So that's something I think we're going to have to grapple with in the relatively near future.
Thank you very much indeed. As we know, the event is only 1 hour long, so we have already run over by a minute or two. So if I could just thank you and express mine and the Hub's gratitude, and for all the people tuning in as well, for you, Paul, and your team at the Center for New American Security. All of your invaluable time, your information, your sharing with us has been excellent. And I would like to thank all of the people who joined us remotely. I sincerely hope you have enjoyed this hour. We hope to see you again at our next Southern Talks, which will be in January of the new year. So from us, even though it's only November, wish you a very serene and peaceful conclusion to 2023 and a very happy new year. Please feel free to go onto the Hub's YouTube page at NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, where the video of this event will be available in the next few days. And with that, I will bring this Zoom event to a close by thanking once again Paul and his team, and wishing you all the very best. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thank you.